And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful. And American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
That was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking in January of this year at the Davos World Economic Forum. It was an important speech, and I have thoughts. First, how refreshing to hear a brilliant world leader give an impassioned and diplomatic speech. In this case, he made clear that Canada is decoupling its economic fortunes from those of the United States. To underscore his words, this is a rupture, not just a transition. So, while Americans may be celebrating Olympic gold in their hockey wins by men's and women's teams at the Olympics in Italy, those are going to start to seem like hollow victories because Canada is distancing itself from more than half a century of integration and free trade. Free trade that's done a lot to raise the fortunes of people on both sides of the border. And judging by the rousing applause Carney received at Davos, many other countries are going to be taking Canada's lead and distancing themselves from an America that increasingly looks like the bad guy on the world stage. This is Pacific Time, the show where we ask what-if questions about the future of the West Coast. I'm your host, Greg Amrofell. And in this episode, I'm with Ashley Brown. We unpack what rupture means, not just for Ottawa and Washington, D.C., but for Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, and the whole West Coast. We're going to drill down on Ashley's Substack article about Carney's breakup note, and we explore whether this is simply a trade dispute or the early stages of a global realignment. If Canada takes steps to hedge against an increasingly unstable U.S., if supply chains decouple, if trust erodes, if other countries come to see Canada and not the U.S. as the most reliable North American trading partner, well, where does that leave the West Coast in the short term and the long term? I start by asking Ashley about his firsthand perspective watching Carney's speech while Ashley was visiting Canada.
I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia for work during Davos, and I listened to his speech the evening of my first night there. And it was pretty remarkable. It is one of the most significant public policy speeches and economic policy speeches that I've heard in my lifetime. But basically, after a year of sort of withering insults and trade barbs from the US, the speech outlined how Canada is going to move forward and what that looks like. Talking to Canadians the next day, it was a huge morale boost because finally, the Prime Minister, who has been the governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England in a very sobering and thoughtful way, he didn't even mention Donald Trump or the United States, incidentally, outlined how Canada is going to navigate the near and long-term future in a world where deepening North American integration is not the priority.
And as you say, we do link to the speech from the Substack article. We'll link to it from the show notes here as well. When Carney said rupture, what exactly is rupturing, Ashley?
So it's important to note that at multiple times in that speech, he referenced integration as a form of coercion. So he said very clearly that negotiating relationships, particularly economic relationships bilaterally, is now negotiating from a position of weakness. so that the only path forward for a middle power, and he characterized Canada as part of a family of middle powers, is through a dense web of trade relationships with other reliable, stable partners. And that is a foundational rupture from Canadian foreign and economic policy since the mid 1960s. And he had a line that I actually made a note of because I thought it was really important, which is you cannot live within that lie that mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your coercion. And what he was essentially outlining is that this is not a Trump thing. He made a point of highlighting that for the last 20 years, 20 plus years, through a series of sort of economic, health, geopolitical crises, that Canada has lived a lie, that they live within this mutually beneficial trade system with the United States, when in reality, they always knew that the United States could exempt itself, but they chose to live with that lie because it was the lie that they told themselves. And now Trump has only been the catalyst to show that they can't live within that lie anymore because that is now the source of their weakness. So it very much felt like he was telling Canadians that a Rubicon had been crossed, that was a permanent reorientation of trade and economic policy.
Yeah. Another line that sticks out for me in that speech from Carney was that nostalgia is not a strategy. In other words, while it's nice to be sentimental about neighborly relations, at some point, Canada has to realize that the US has not been acting like a very good neighbor. And I think this is really impactful for us on the West Coast and in the Pacific Northwest in particular, because here we are, right up against British Columbia, and the same lesson applies to us that we are subject to American national policy, US national policy, and the neighborly relationship can no longer be assumed.
Yeah, he had another interesting line there, which, um, was meant to hit Canadians a little bit differently than it will hit you and I. But it was that Canada needed to embrace what he called values based pragmatism,
Mhm.
which is that Canada will continue to act according to its values on the world stage, but that it might occasionally find a partner that is beneficial economically or politically with whom it doesn't always align in values, and that's okay. And the prime minister said it's important to take on the world as it is, not as you want it to be. And I think that that also can apply for us in Washington. Only we're we're kind of the bad guys in that scenario, but we also have to embrace, I think, on the West Coast, some values-based pragmatism, where this is not the world that we want it to be either, but it's the world that we have. And I think we're going to talk today about how we go from there.
Yeah, and I mean to further decode that line from Carney, I think what he's hinting at is he imagines moving more toward trading relationships that center on China on one hand and Europe on the other, and de-emphasizing, if not fully cutting off, but de-emphasizing the trading relationship with the US.
That was absolutely 100% crystal clear.
Yeah. Okay. As someone who's studied Canada extensively, could you give us a very quick history of US Canadian trade relations?
Yeah. So here is the hopefully 30-second or less version. Canada US trade integration essentially started in the 60s with a thing called the Auto Pact, which essentially created a free trade environment for the construction of automobiles and automobile parts. That trucked along, worked really, really well, caused a blooming of the North American auto industry. So that led to negotiations all throughout the 80s in particular about broadening that free trade environment. We ended up getting that in the 90s with the North American Free Trade Agreement. We brought Mexico into that agreement as well. NAFTA essentially, in a very broad way, liberalized trade between all three countries, broke down almost all tariff regimes. Effectively, producing something in Canada was essentially as you were producing it in the US from a trans-border perspective. That flourished and continued on for another 30 years until the first Trump administration, when convinced that we were getting a bum deal from NAFTA, We renegotiated the NAFTA agreement in 2018. It came into force in 2020. We call it the US Mexico Canada Agreement. It has different names in Canada and Mexico, but it essentially was the version 2 replacement for NAFTA. And then 6 years later, here we are finding Donald Trump essentially tearing up or wanting to tear up the agreement that he negotiated in his first term and waging a broad based tariff war against the world.
So that to me is a story of deep and long running ties between neighboring countries where the plan had been for the countries to work toward their areas of specialization and also to collaborate when possible, that rising tides would lift all boats across the border. Does that seem like a fair summary, or would you pick that apart?
That is a fair summary. It's also really interesting to dive into a little bit of the psychology of NAFTA. It was a very controversial agreement in the US. It was also very controversial in Canada. There was an entire federal election fought on whether Canada should actually have free trade with the United States in an unfettered way. Maybe part of the sense of betrayal today comes from, people remember that that was a very difficult decision to do in the first place. But then they went all in.
So, Ashley, you've given us a grounding in the big picture of trade between the US and Canada, but it gets way more detailed when it comes down to trade between the countries. And really, if we want to get hyper specific, let's talk about trade between Washington state and Canada. What characterizes the flow of goods between the two places?
Yeah, so just going through some like top level stats, Washington Canada trade, that's a $29 billion a year relationship. Canada is the number one export market for Washington agriculture and also fish and seafood. Washington wines exported about $18 million a year worth of product to Canada. There's been a 97% decline in those exports. So effectively, the Washington wine export industry to Canada has been completely erased. To put that $18 million in perspective, the wine industry in total has lost about 100 million. So it's about 20% of the US wine market was Washington wines alone. The export of US spirits to Canada down 85%. A large part of that is due to boycotts by Canadian provinces of Washington wines and US alcohol more broadly. Only two provinces still allow the sale of US alcohol, and that's Alberta and Saskatchewan. So BC, which was obviously a huge export market for us, is now closed off. Tourism, it's down roughly 25% nationally, but it's down 30 to 40% in Washington. So we're really taking it on the chin as a border state for whom there was a lot of cross-border shopping in particular. Land border crossings are down actually even more, but air crossings are also down pretty significantly. Just in the last couple of weeks, WestJet and Air Canada announced that they were eliminating roughly a third of their capacity to the US.
Yeah, and Ashley, you told me a story about this just to really put it in perspective about your experience flying back from Canada to the US right after Carney's speech. What did you experience then?
Yeah, so I think I told you I was in Halifax, and so my trip home was supposed to be Halifax, Toronto, Toronto, Seattle, but it turns out that my Air Canada Toronto to Seattle flight, which had 125 seats in economy, there were only 9 people on it. And so for quote unquote operational reasons, Air Canada canceled my flight and stranded me in Halifax, and it ended up taking me 2 days to get home, and the only way I could get home was through New York. So the fact that airlines, WestJet and Air Canada, are cutting some of these routes, and in fact, Air Canada, by the way, just cut the Seattle to Montreal um, route. The fact that they're even the routes they don't cut, they are often operationally canceling if there aren't enough people to make the flight, enough people in cargo to make the flight worth going.
Yeah, and I know just speaking personally that a couple friends of ours in BC are happy to have us come visit them in Vancouver, but they've made clear that they will not be crossing the border our direction anytime soon.
I have a good friend who lives in Toronto who has made it very clear. Again, she's happy for me to come to Toronto, but not coming to the US. So same story. I think we
Yeah.
all anecdotally probably have friends and relationships like that.
So wine, spirits, travel and hospitality. What about agriculture?
Potash is, of course, the big unsexy one that no one ever talks about. Essentially, potash is a mineral that is an essential ingredient of modern agriculture. We buy in Washington a ton of it from Canada. Canada actually gives us about 85% of our potash. So it's something that Washington farms essentially rely on. It's just a symbol of, when Donald Trump says that we don't need anything from Canada, he apparently has never spoken to a farmer. The only other source of potash, by the way, is Belarus. So we're not going to get our potash from Belarus anytime soon. But, that is something that is essential that we get from Canada. Couple of other things that are just anecdotally interesting for Washington industries and West Coast industries in particular. Back to aviation, Air Canada has historically been very loyal to Boeing. Air Canada is in the middle of an ultra long haul fleet renewal. So older versions of the 777 need to be replaced. They just announced on February 11th that they have ordered 8 Airbus 350-1000s with an option for 8 more. That's the first and largest Airbus order Air Canada has ever placed. There's a caveat there with the A220. If any of our listeners are aviation geeks, I know about the A220, but it's a separate thing.
Are you an
I can't
aviation geek, Ashley? Is that what you're trying to say?
I am an aviation geek. So sidebar really quickly, the AT20 used to be manufactured by Bombardier, which is obviously a Canadian company. Um, and then another thing that really hasn't been talked about very much is that today Canada, well, first of all, Canada is doubling defense spending by 2035. Um, and they currently buy about 70 to 75% of their military equipment from the US. Carney has said that they are going to locally source or source from non-US sources 70% of that by 2035. So that is a massive shift in procurement from US defense companies, which are heavily presenced on the West Coast. And then, of course, the Lockheed Martin F-35 order is completely up in the air. They might replace it with the Saab Gripen instead, which will be manufactured in Canada and, of course, achieve that goal. So we're looking at a significant economic relationship on the West Coast that's being disrupted. But in particular industries, it's a catastrophe.
Yeah. And I know, just to expand on this military point, the idea that Canada would sort of decouple from the American military industrial complex is not just about lost income and jobs. Aligning on our platforms means that there's common resources for maintenance and for training and cross training. And so the idea that Canada might align itself with European manufacturers or maybe even Chinese manufacturers around security is destabilizing to the U.S. In the long haul in ways that go beyond economics.
Yeah, I mean, the US has certainly benefited from being the largest defense producer and consumer in NATO. And because of our shared hemispheric defense, particularly through NORAD, that has been especially true with Canada. Air defense, for instance, of the continent is essentially the same air force at this point, and that would not be the case going forward.
It's a lot to take in. I mean, it highlights that, kind of rhetoric and strong words being exchanged between heads of state is really just the tip of the iceberg, that the economic impacts of a changed relationship between the US and Canada are going to be felt for a long time in a lot of ways by a lot of people. So, what, Ashley, do you consider the single most underestimated economic consequence of this reset between the US and Canada?
That a lot of it's voluntary. This is where the last line of my essay comes into play. The last line of my essay is, it turns out the betrayal cuts deeper. One thing that I heard from people I've been to Canada twice this year, by the way. I've been to Toronto and Halifax. And one thing that I heard from people on both trips was that it wasn't just about the tariffs. The tariffs are boring economics. It was about the betrayal. And it was the crux of that is not that they view Donald Trump as crazy and erratic. It's that the way we imposed tariffs on Canada in the first place was a great big lie. Donald Trump used that excuse of fentanyl coming across the northern border, which basically does not happen. And it's objectively, empirically false, and yet Congress did absolutely nothing. Congress just let him impose illegal tariffs on our closest ally and deepest trading partner, and that's the betrayal that cuts deeper. And moreover, we send 20% of our exports to Canada, and seemingly business leaders were more interested in maintaining, in their view, a close relationship with the Trump administration for whether that be regulatory or just fear of being on the bad side rules than standing up for their largest export market.
Yeah, I mean, so easy to pin this all on Donald Trump, but Congress deserves some blame. And by the way, the American public didn't stand up and say, "Hey, turns out the Canadian economy is important to us. We need to look out. We need to look out for it too."
Yeah, and I mean, even I look at our Washington congressional delegation. They have said things, but I think they could have been louder, and they could have been more vocal. A lot of it feels like press release rather than concrete action. So I think there's just disappointment, and again, I come back to a sense of betrayal all around.
So Canadians don't put much stock in our strongly written letters either, do they?
No.
Is this a temporary boycott or the beginning of a permanent shift in trade between Canada and the US?
So in my view, I think it's permanent, and I think that for a couple of reasons. I take Mark Carney at his word. When you read his speech, he was not outlining a strategy to survive the next 3 years. He was outlining a strategy to survive for the next 100 years in a world where great powers are hegemonic and in competition with one another, and the middle powers, as he defines them, need to find a way to negotiate from a position of strength. And again, that is a multipolar, dense web of alliances of convenience in some cases. They called it pragmatism, that essentially de-risks any, one overwhelming relationship with another. And to implement that vision, that only happens if you pivot away from integration with the United States.
So this is a permanent shift. Does that hold, Ashley, even now with the Supreme Court ruling against the Trump administration on tariffs? Has the damage been done or could it be reversed?
So I think the damage has been done, but I also think it's important to call out three things. We're in the heat of the moment, the part of the time where everyone's really angry. We are not enemies. We are still trade partners. We still do a lot of trade with each other. I think it's likely Canada will be uh, our largest trading partner, and we will be Canada's largest trading partner for decades, if not potentially the rest of our lifetime. There are immense cultural, historical values and business ties across the border. But I do think that we are in a when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time moment, where again, we fall into that values based pragmatism framework wherein Canada might find it beneficial economically, socially, politically, defense wise to maintain a lot of these relationships with the US, but they're doing it with very open eyes. I think the fact that the SCOTUS decision wasn't close is is good, but I keep coming back to we signed a free trade agreement in 2018 that came into effect in 2020. That deal is barely 6 years old. We essentially used a transparent lie to tear it up. So again, I come back to when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time.
Yeah, that this may have more to do with trust than any particular deal or tariff or anything else. And Canadians having said after 10 years of Trump, you know, in office or in influence, that after 10 years of Trump's influence in the US, that they've lost trust in the US as a partner.
I would say that I believe that that is absolutely true. I think it's also interesting if you go back and read the prime minister's speech, he says multiple times that maybe that trust was misplaced from the very beginning.
Mm.
That again, they were living within a lie where they were willing to take prior American bad faith actions and sort of set it aside and say, we live within a rules based order. Overall, things are good. We're getting more out of this than we're giving, even if it has always been an asymmetrical relationship.
There's something that came to mind as you were talking to that the story of countries or companies collapsing is never about them going from $100 million a year in revenue to 0. It's about their growth disappearing and just tilting down, and all of a sudden, the path to 0 becomes much more likely. And it strikes me that, US-Canada trade is an example of this, where it may not be the demolition of the American economy or the Canadian economy, but it's starting to point at an unavoidable trend that should really be concerning to all of us in the US and in Canada. Um, what would rebuilding trust with Canada look like?
So I think that to rebuild trust, obviously we have to have a different administration. I think the next administration has to, from just a PR perspective, find many, many different ways to say, I'm sorry. But I think in a concrete way, no one will take us seriously unless we codify into ironclad law ways to ensure that this never happens again. And then I think we have the foundation, which will then take probably decades to recover.
Yeah. I've heard it said that trust is about simply doing what you say, and when trust has been broken, you have to show that you do what you say over and over and over again to really demonstrate that you mean it this time. And so, yeah, with the US basically tossing aside treaties and agreements, they have broken trust and on very flimsy premises, this fentanyl thing being an example.
And just fundamentally, we all have those people in our lives who feel very transactional. You don't ever hear from them until they're job hunting or their friend needs something or a colleague needs something. We don't trust those people, right? We don't actively maybe go out of our way to dislike them or not help them, but we understand that the relationship is a transactional one. It's not a trustworthy one.
Which seems to be the stance that Carney's laying out. Let's just be, as Canadians, let's be realistic about what we can expect from the US. Yeah. Okay. Let's bring this home and talk about the regional stakes of a strained US Canada relationship. We could say that for decades, Cascadia, the region that runs up and down the Northwest coast from Alaska all the way down into Northern California, has felt more like a coherent region than a border with a real identity that Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, that region generates $675 billion in GDP in output, that it has shared housing crises, that it has the need for shared infrastructure with cars and trucks and trains moving back and forth, and similar climate opportunities and issues. So, is Cascadia and the idea of a greater region that transcends the national or state borders, is Cascadia collateral damage in a national trade war?
Yes, I don't think it can be helped. I mean, 40% of Washington's jobs depend at some level on international trade. And when you are tariffing the entire world, particularly our largest trading partner, the scars of that sort of economically are absolutely going to be real. It's going to be felt in really interesting ways. So trans-Pacific trade, for example, if you have a decision to send something to the West Coast and before it could be Vancouver, LA, or Seattle, say, well, now because of tariffs, it has to be Vancouver. Shipping, I think, is going to be where you see this sort of most acutely felt. Also interesting, a lot of interprovincial trade barriers in Canada are down. So it used to be in some cases more efficient to trade with the States than to trade to other provinces in Canada. That's no longer going to be the case. Canada also has lots of things that the world needs. So, for us, a 15% tariff is going to be painfully high. Canada is busy negotiating free trade agreements, with the rest of the world. like from our shared experience, the last time we waged a tariff war was with China in the first Trump administration, and you saw trade patterns permanently alter. And so, one, when we have our federal government making trade with Canada more difficult, and you have Canada's federal government making trade for, say, British Columbia easier with the rest of the world, I think you're going to see just a natural reorientation within our region of we just trade less with each other as Canada trains more with the rest of the world.
Yeah. And Canada's got real assets. I mean, it is one of the world's top producers of timber and one of the world's top producers of oil and gas. So, yeah, it's got good chips to work with. Will the West Coast or the Pacific Northwest be able to salvage something here? Or is Canada going to collectively punish the US in the same way that the US collectively punishes countries like Russia and Iran when we
Mhm.
have disagreements with their policies?
So I don't think a comparison with Russia and Iran's is a good one for a couple reasons. One, we didn't attack Canada. We're not actually adversaries on the international stage. We're still allies. However strained that relationship may be, we still are allies and work together. Also, again, I come back to a lot of the tariffs aside, a lot of Canada's response has been just the voluntary actions of everyday Canadians, whereas we obviously aggressively sanction both Iran and Russia. So there are just fundamental differences there. But yes, I think that there is stuff to be salvaged. I mean, when I look at our relationship with both British Columbia and Alberta, actually, we have common interests on border policy. It's in the interest of both sides to ensure that the trade that does happen at the border, which is still significant, is as frictionless as possible. We have obviously a shared interest in climate. We share the same climate here. And so, have obviously we're going in the same direction on climate change. Culturally, our regions at British Columbia and Washington are just culturally very similar, especially on things like the environment. When we look at BC's neighbor next door, energy policy, there's still a lot of common ground there. We import a lot of energy from Canada in general, be that hydro and nuclear in the east, but obviously oil from and gas from Alberta in the west. I mean, you can't overlook sort of deep historical and cultural connections and 70 years of business connections as well. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say the Wildfire Pact, which exists between Washington, Oregon, and Alberta, where we help each other out during wildfire season every year. So there's, I think there are a lot of things where, states and provinces are powerful, and I think there's a lot of space for uh, our governors um, to get creative and see if we can potentially try to deepen or preserve at least those ties on a one-to-one basis, bilateral basis, I guess you could say.
So, Ashley, let's talk scenarios. Could you characterize a sort of best case, worst case, and most likely case when it comes to Canadian and Pacific Northwest trade?
So I think the best case would be trade normalizes slash grows. The relationship recovers swiftly after the end of the Trump administration. Canada hedges, but keeps the US in a pragmatic way central to its economy, and tourism recovers.
I mean, hey, Katy Perry's dating Justin Trudeau, so, that's a promising sign, right?
Yes, sure. I think the middle case is what I would probably call the long kiss goodnight, which is the economy is just not in any dramatic fashion, but just slowly drift apart. And the high water mark of North American integration was, 2016. Uh, tourism never fully recovers, which would be pretty devastating, particularly for our regional economy. And that supply chains are permanently altered in ways that we don't anticipate. I think the worst case scenario would be much more adversarial, right? Some form of permanent decoupling, walking away from The USMCA would probably fall into the worst case scenario. I think we can all acknowledge that Brexit was probably one of the worst self inflicted wounds in modern economic history. Walking away from free trade with Canada and Mexico would be probably exponentially levels worse than that. Worst case for the United States would be a lot of reshoring north of the border. So, rather than continuing to trade and pay the tariff, the decision's made that that no amount of tariff is worth paying. And we're willing to sacrifice efficiency for sovereignty, essentially.
Make this concrete, Ashley. Am I ever going to be able to ski Whistler again? And is maple syrup going to become an impossible luxury?
I think you'll probably always be able to ski Whistler because even in a worst case, they'd be happy to take your money. Maple syrup might become very, very, very expensive. Um, but I think the better example would be something that we talked about when we were uh, discussing what the show would look like, which was your example of solar panels, where we for some reason make it very difficult to import, say, Chinese solar panels, but Canada obviously has a trade agreement with China, and so Canadians benefit from maybe a Chinese solar panel plant being built in British Columbia that might have been built in Washington State, and instead it gets built in BC. But then we also ban the Chinese solar panels, or solar panels are subject to an outrageously high tariff. So then, not only do we not have the solar panel plant, but we don't get the solar panels either.
More oil and gas, which is only going to get more expensive because we may have cut off our access to Canadian oil and gas.
Correct.
But good news, we may have access to Venezuelan oil and gas again someday, some decade.
Yes, a type of oil and gas we really don't know how to refine, but I guess that's the industrial renaissance that is in our future, is building new oil refineries.
It's come to this, Ashley. We're making jokes about oil refining.
Instead of building green energy.
Yes. Yes. All right. So if you're the governor of Washington, Bob Ferguson, what are your top three moves in the face of a deteriorating relationship with Canada?
So I probably think that we're in the middle case now, but hope that we could land probably at the worst case somewhere between the middle and the best case. Again, I come back to the economic relationship is so vast now that if I were Governor Ferguson, I would focus on the things that I could immediately have some control over. Because I think the best thing to do in an emergency is get control over the things that you can control and try to de-risk or minimize the things that are out of your control. So, one, I would lean on my federal representatives to try and rein in the administration internationally. That's not really in my control, but I can try. But again, I would focus on making sure the border is staffed in a coordinated way. Freight continues to run efficiently. I think there's a lot we could do on just joint port planning. And if I were Washington, I would devote state resources to one, promoting tourism and trying to build a Washington brand that's independent of the US. I know that's a hard slog and would probably take a really long time to be effective, but I think it's at least good PR. But then I would also devote state resources to fighting the administration in court. So one thing that governor can do is direct the attorney general or work with the attorney general to sue, as the state of Oregon did, to overturn things like tariffs. Then I just think of all the cross-border sectors that are not sort of federal responsibility or impacted by tariffs. So that's energy coordination and grid reliability. We import and export electricity across the border all the time. Again, I come back to wildfire response, which is something that's critically important to both Western Canada and the Western US. And then something that's probably near and dear to your heart, which is R&D partnerships between universities or sort of non-state research groups. Those are regional necessities. They're not ideological in any way.
Now, Ashley, the headline of your Substack essay made reference to the possibility of high speed rail through the Cascadia corridor from Portland to Seattle to Vancouver. Do you think that's something that, as governor of Washington State, you'd continue advocating?
I would continue to advocate for it. It's certainly something that the region definitely needs. When we look at Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, what they call the Cascadia Rail Corridor, it's forecast to add something like 3 million more people by 2050. Getting around isn't particularly easy right now. If you were to get on the train in Portland, by the time you get off of it in Vancouver, you've been on that train for 8 hours, and that's assuming the border is pretty easy, which it usually is on the train, but you never know. High speed rail would cover that in two. So that the obvious economic benefits of high speed rail through that corridor are vast. So, as the governor of Washington, absolutely we could continue to promote it. Governor Ferguson has. We've set aside state money for feasibility studies. There's a memorandum of understanding in place between British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon to build it one day. That said, the current US administration's hostility to seemingly any form of public transport, I think, makes that a fragile thing to begin with. And then right now in this environment, an $85 billion transborder infrastructure, I think is probably dead on arrival. And I actually have a quote in my essay from the former British Columbia Minister of Transport speaking at a Cascadia Rail conference. He said, there's virtually no public appetite for this conversation right now.
Hmm. My dream of an impossibly fast trip to Vancouver is seemingly dashed. That's hard to hear.
Also dashed, a potential future world where we had free movement of people and you could live in Washington and work in Vancouver or vice versa. And that sub-hour commute would have made that possible.
Hmm.
That's what I'm really sad about.
So, Ashley, let's play our favorite game of asking what if questions about Canada and US relations, and Canada and the Pacific Northwest. I'll start. Let me ask a what if question, and then you chime in. So what if Canada, which faces a real labor shortage for its much discussed national health system or provincial health system, what if it started offering beleaguered U.S. healthcare professionals jobs and work permits in Canada?
Yeah, this is a what if that's already happening. You can see commercials on television here in Washington and California where essentially they're saying, "Hey, come live your dream in Canada." I think this is a real risk for the U.S. healthcare system, which is, immigration in Canada is both a federal and provincial responsibility. Provinces can select immigration applicants that they want to preference to live in their province, and I think that British Columbia should take a look at it, and I think they will, and I think they are.
What are your what if questions, Ashley?
I would be interested what would happen if Canadian universities started luring significant amounts of R&D talent away. We've seen an unprecedented assault on particularly medical research in this country and a hostility on the part of the HHS secretary to novel technologies like mRNA. What if Canada decided to really own the podium in that respect and lure those folks and those dollars away?
Which is another hypothetical that may actually be happening. Certainly, Canadian universities and biomedical research organizations are already actively recruiting American scientists, as are they in Europe. I just think Canada may have the advantage of being relatively close by and in similar time zones. So that's something that we may well see happen before long. What other what if questions come to mind about US and Canada relations?
Much like the healthcare angle, what if Canada made recruiting top tier technology talent, particularly say AI talent, um, a critical priority? I think Canada has a potentially once in a generation what if to do that, and also a once in a generation what if opportunity to recruit things like advanced chip developers. to locate to Canada instead of the US because it's a more reliable export market.
So, Ashley, could you, in a few sentences, summarize where we're at with U.S. Canada relations, what that means for us here in the Northwest, and where you think things are going?
I think we're at a probably multi-generational low. We've certainly never seen, I think, relations and relationships this frayed, certainly since the Second World War. I saw someone joke on the internet that they haven't been this bad since Canada burned down the White House, which I thought was a little bit of much needed humor. So I think that's where we are. I think this might be more hope, but I do see potentially after the midterms some sanity returning to the question of economic policy and Congress taking back its its rightful responsibility in setting tariffs. Um, I think I think it's probably knock wood a certainty that the Democrats will take control of the House. I think the Democrats are actually going to win the Senate too.
I asked a question earlier about whether the damage had been done. That's an American perspective. I wonder if, from a Canadian perspective, you might look at this as something quite the opposite of damage, that Canada has been woken up from a stupor, from a codependent relationship on the US, and that Canadians are going to be asserting their sovereignty and building up their capability and luring great talent and great companies in ways that are going to give them permanent advantages. And if from a Canadian perspective, you might on some level say, thank you, Donald Trump, for waking us up to the opportunity to be more truly ourselves.
Yeah, I actually think that that's right. And in an earlier iteration of the essay, I sort of ended on explored the point of is this next century, to borrow an old phrase, does it belong to Canada in this exact sense? That it's going to be hard, and the prime minister was also very clear about this. He said a world of fortresses is going to be poor. So he was not sugarcoating that the next several years are probably going to be hard as the economy and industries reorient, and also everyone sort of emotionally comes to terms with we're not friends from the Canadian perspective. I actually don't think that there's anything but upside in the moves that the Canadian government is making today, particularly around trade relationships. They're busily tearing down barriers to trade, both interprovincially with the EU, with China. They just signed a free trade pact with Mercosur, which essentially opens up all of South America. So they're hard at work building a different future.
We've spent decades assuming the US Canada relationship was a given, a stable pillar of North America and an extension of Cascadia here in the Northwest. These assumptions are no longer safe. So, if global partners are hedging, if trust is eroding, well, then the Pacific Northwest and the whole West Coast have choices to make. Do we wait for Washington, D.C. to restore stability? Do we begin strengthening regional ties right away? Do we have to choose between aligning with D.C. or with B.C.? What do you think? Is this rupture temporary or the beginning of something structural? Be sure to read Ashley's Substack companion piece to this episode. It's called Derailed, and you can find it by looking up @Pacific Time Podcast on Substack. Please share your thoughts, subscribe, and pass this article along to people you know who understand that being a good neighbor means more than just taking care of the people that live on your block. Thanks for being with us in Pacific Time. Let's keep asking the what if questions about the future of the West Coast. We'll see you next time.